Honest question, what the hell is a finished video game? In early gaming history, much like most other forms of art, a finished product was synonymous with when it was premiered. When Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy released the PS2 in 2001, it was released as a definitively finished product. Due to games needing to be burned onto CDs or put into cartridges or just hardwired into cabinet motherboards, changes to video games could not affect prior versions of the product. However, when games were updated and released in new batches, ones with bug fixes and minor gameplay changes, unlike something like books, players weren't really made aware of new additions. Many times nowadays, speedrunning communities for older games seek out specific cartridges or CDs, older versions with the flaws that make certain tricks and glitches work, and many times it's difficult or just not possible to easily check what version the game is on. For all intents and purposes, to the developers, they were selling the same experience, so no designation had to be made. And yet, outside of major issues with the game, however it released is what it would be forever. For some games this was an absolute blessing for its longevity. Super Smash Bros. Melee, while it was carried originally in competitive circles due to its fast-paced gameplay, has been able to stay alive as a game for 23 years now in spite of seemingly everything trying to stop them. And while its community needs credit for pushing against endless fights with Nintendo and sponsors and its own community alike, the thing bringing people back to the game after all this time is largely just how broken it is. In general, when it comes to development of a competitive game's meta, and as the fabric of the game is tested, clear shortcomings and unintended exploits begin to be discovered. Things are much stronger or weaker than expected, simple oversights or thoughtless decisions become critically important. In Melee, a move originally thought to be weak and highly situational, Fox's Shine, was found to both have a hitbox and invulnerability on the very first frame of it activating. Likely being a simple and quick decision during development, potentially done for any number of reasons, from making it more of a defensive get-off-me option to the hitbox being placed there so that certain move strengths clash with it, what Shine became is the single strongest move in Fox's entire toolkit, able to be used alongside other exploits like wave dashing to be cancelled early, leading to combos entirely consisting of just shines, being an easy edge guarding option, being useful for anything and everything you could possibly imagine. Marth's grab range extending far beyond him, reliable rest setups for Jigglypuff. Pieces of these fighting kits that define the strength of these characters couldn't have possibly all been considered due to the massive size of the game and the relatively small size of the development team. In the modern day, competitive games of all kinds are released with the inherent understanding that the game will be repeatedly and endlessly adjusted throughout the years as the player base scrutinizes more and more of the nichest aspects of it. This is done on top of new content being expected to be added at regular intervals, with games like Rainbow Six Siege becoming these disgusting bloated messes of so many new operators that the idea of balancing just becomes impossible. Several characters have been clearly just abandoned by the development team because there are literally just too many operators to possibly hold together, all while a new one is still added every 3 months, needing an endless content drip to remain alive and active. Melee, in comparison, has been the same game since it was released and has stayed eternally relevant. That's not to say that Melee is flawless, I mean god no. The Melee that is played today in big sponsored tournaments is a fraction of the entire video game called Super Smash Bros. Melee. So many game modes and stages and characters have been utterly wiped out by the passage of time. What has made the game survive and kept it perpetually played is the core of the video game, its pure gameplay loop. And so, in the eyes of its active player base, its useful glitches have become more of a part of what Melee is than the vast majority of the intended game itself. It's easy to say that old games were better because they were definitively finished at release, but what we don't tend to see are the thousands of games that were released, never changed, and died near immediately. Games with potentially good ideas, fun elements, but never given the chance to adjust their direction towards something better. Live service games, despite having their own deluge of problems, do come with the potential promise that it can adapt itself to what the community wants from it. A development team with an ear to the ground and an open mind can work with their community, both casual and competitive players alike, to maximize the fun and minimize the jank, turning a game that would have died in months to something that can last much, much longer. However, sometimes, even in the modern day, the jank becomes a game's most iconic quality. Trackmania is an arcade racing game series that has been out nearly as long as Melee has, releasing their first entry in 2003, and has made the willing decision to change the formula as little as they possibly can with every new entry. The normal gameplay relies entirely on simple controls and creative mapping. While you only have 4 buttons at your disposal, forward, back, left, and right, the tracks can be flat, diagonal, upside down, even flying in midair. They feature wild jumps, loopings, boost pads, and more, placing your skill not just in your ability to drive, but your ability to understand and navigate the maps themselves. Arguably the most popular entry, Trackmania Nations Forever, has a 65 map campaign that has been dissected and refined over the course of the last 16 years, and through that dissection, several map-breaking bugs and discoveries have been found. Map EO2, one of the longest and hardest in the game, has been broken with the use of overwalls, exploits where you slam into the sides of the track at the right speed and angle to just hop right over it. D13 has 2 turns obliterated by bug slides, a bug where turning your car 90 degrees and holding your brake gives you infinite grip. A12 lets you skip the map entirely with the use of a Uber bug, a trick where you bug slide into the side of a wall and get a completely random launch at speeds going into the thousands for reasons that people still don't quite understand. Nations Forever was a game released well into the Steam era of PC gaming, fully capable of being patched and updated, but not once have these bugs actually been corrected. In fact, in every single entry of the Stadium environment, the one Nations Forever uses, these bugs have existed and been actively allowed to do so. Nadeo, the developers of the series, have patched issues in the past. They tried to remove an exploit in Canyon, a different environment, where driving backwards gave much quicker speeds than driving forwards ever could, but these have never even been attempted to be removed, and have become core parts of specific kinds of map building. This sort of fascination with the game's rough edges has led to one of the most popular events in Trackmania history, Khaki Khaki, a biannual event where thousands of players try their best to complete maps that are just barely possible, stretching the definition of what driving in this game can possibly even be considered. The newest entry to the series is a live service game called Trackmania 2020, and unlike former entries, has new campaigns regularly made every 3 months for the game. And, through that, we can see the philosophy of the developers shift as time has moved on. After the rough first couple campaigns, Nadeo tried to intermingle with community mappers, slowly adopting their philosophy. All of this culminated in the fall 2022 campaign, where one of the final and hardest maps in the campaign, Map 22, had a turn explicitly designed for a bug slide. Normal players had to play this map. Even further, in the game's esports scene, the Trackmania World Tour, Nadeo seemed to milk the entertainment factor out of just subjecting these inhumanly good players to as cruel and unusual of maps as possible. Each and every professional track had what was called an identity, one trick or section that was as absurd as they were unique, forcing these poor drivers to exploit the game's physics in ways the developers never intended to, but are now actively encouraging. From things as wild as khaki maps to as simple as counter-steering on ice, Trackmania as a finished product is built and intentionally perpetuated on things that were originally never meant to be a part of the game. Trackmania 2020 is a broken video game, and yet simultaneously complete. Okay, and knowing that, what's DLC about? Ever since games could potentially be changed after release, extra bits of content have been offered to players at an additional charge, money and all that, and yet downloadable content always seems to keep a semantic difference from the original completed product. On an actual functional level, it makes complete sense. Interweaving new content with a fully completed game is not always going to work, especially for people who don't want to play an entire game just for new bits of content after the fact. And so, games need to structure themselves to make it one separated experience. Narratively, DLCs almost never affect the main plot in any important way outside of exposition. They straight up can't. Most often they take place after the plot of the original story if the writers want important things to happen to the main cast that otherwise couldn't be explained, but other times they serve as unconnected vignettes into different worlds entirely. The Dark Souls games try their best to integrate DLC right into the world, making the way you access them just like the way you do most story progression, in incredibly obscure and unapproachable ways. So getting to the Artorias of the Abyss DLC in Dark Souls 1 is actually quite simple. So first things first, get to Inner Londo and kill Ornstein and Smo, get the Lord Vessel from Princess Guinevere of course, place the Lord Vessel with the help of Frant or Kaith, you have options here. Unlock the path to the Duke's Archives, make your way down to Darkroot Garden, everyone knows where that is, I don't even need to tell you. Run down along the cliffside into Darkroot Basin as God intended, kill a Hydra. That's fine. Cut all of its heads off, but don't get too close because there's a cliff in the water. There's an invisible cliff in the water where you will fall off and die. Run over to the backside of the lake, find nothing there, save and quit, load back in, kill the golden golem that is now spawned, talk to the woman that was inside of it, say yes to her, warp to Inner Londo to get to the entrance to the Duke's Archives, take the elevator, kill a random golem protected by a horde of enemies, get a broken pendant, make your way all the way back to the lake, run back around to where the golden golem was, and there will be a portal that, once examined, will gingerly take you to Ulasil, the start of the DLC. Now, PC players had this come with the special Prepare to Die edition, but console players had to specifically buy this DLC. If you beat the game, killed the final boss and chose one of the endings, you were just thrown into New Game Plus immediately. There is no post-game, so if you had already beaten Dark Souls, the DLC was not possible to reach until you get all the way to Inner Londo again. This is one of the funniest things in gaming, I swear to God. Now, it seems like From Software learned their lesson in later entries, making the bar to enter the DLC much easier to find and simpler to do. The second game in the series, in Tradition, doesn't tell you where to go go either. All you need to do though is make your way to behind where you killed the Rotten, and a brand new portal will just be sitting there, ready to take you to the new content. This is the philosophy that later From Software games and most other narrative-driven RPGs take on, putting some semi-innocuous object or NPC that sends you off to DLC land, cleanly separated from everything else in the story in almost every way. And, as DLC has become more and more frequent, this has largely become the norm for any sort of genre. It's not so much a part of the finished product as it is a high-budget canon fanfiction, taking the world and aesthetic and gameplay of the finished product and giving it another spin, not as strictly bound to the setting and rules of the original experience. And yet, to every rule, there are exceptions. Dark Souls 1 was not the first nor last game to try and interweave new content with the old, but its packaging has changed in the following years. The Binding of Isaac started as a flash game, with the simple concept of repeating randomly generated floors and items out of a pool, making every single one unique despite the gameplay loop itself technically being the same thing every time. For some people, this game is essentially infinite longevity, but over the years, expansions have been made not just adding new characters or modes, things separate from the original game, but instead changing the game's DNA itself. The Binding of Isaac was followed by The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, a bolstered version of the original game due to its success. Since then, DLCs have been released, and yet despite them being considered DLCs, the very title of the game itself changes with each one. A year after Rebirth's release came The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth, adding hundreds of new items, new game routes, new story elements, new secrets and combos and characters and variations and items. Around 1 year later again came The Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus, doing the very same thing. 4 years later came The Binding of Isaac Repentance, an even bigger, larger, super duper Isaac, and with each one, the amount of DLC required naturally raised the price of the game with it. And so, we have a situation where the original game, The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, is still $15, but each individual entry, unique and separate in terms of content and balancing, has a worth that reflects the amount of video game inside of it. And then there are games like Terraria. Now, Terraria is a one-time payment. There are no microtransactions, no subscription service, and yet new content has been consistently added to the game since release for well over a decade. This is good. The arrival of indie games with the proliferation of Steam and the internet in general has allowed small teams or just singular people to create virally successful works. And while many indie studios still follow the approach of one-and-done game releases, moving from one game to the next to stay relevant, there are companies like Relogic that keep the revenue flowing by exclusively sticking to one game. For whatever reason, this is most common with survival games. Terraria, The Forest, Rust, Don't Starve, Valheim, Subnautica, Lethal Company, Astroneer, fucking Minecraft. The most successful often have easy access mod support, allowing the community to do essentially what DLC does but in smaller doses and for free, taking the world and mechanics of these games and making something new within it, not bound by the restrictions of lore or wide appeal or balance. And while for each individual player it's a one-time payment, keeping your game culturally relevant in the gaming sphere will keep a steady stream of new players coming into your game, making every single sale a new boon of profit and cultural relevance. The very best games at this become their own little mini industry, often having niche YouTube channels and Twitch streamers entirely dedicated to it, getting free PR and ensuring that you stay a fixture because a whole lot more people than just your employees have bills to pay using your game to do so. These games were finished at release, and yet they remain in a constant state of growth and change because that is what's needed most of the time to remain relevant to the gaming world. However, there's a rougher, even smaller subset of these sorts of forever games, and it all has to do with something called Steam Early Access. In the past, early access to video games was a rare and special commodity. For AAA developers working on major projects, having earlier versions leak would give away a lot of competitive edge and even potentially hype factor for games that have been worked on for years and years ahead of time. Controlled betas have existed in the past, but they were almost always done relatively close to a game's release. Overwatch's open beta, one of the most successful in history, clocked out at nearly 10 million players overall, finally closing just 2 weeks from the game's official release. Early access was even bundled with certain games. Crackdown, a very solid game in its own right, is almost entirely known nowadays for having been bundled with an invitation to the Halo 3 multiplayer beta, and ended up selling over 1.5 million copies largely due to that temporary access. Betas for AAA releases more often serve as a measure of confidence, turning what would normally be a risk for the game's hype and sales into a gambit, one that might turn a large game into an absolute phenomenon. Now, the issue with games, even fairly small ones, is that they cost a ridiculous amount of time, energy, and money to make, especially for solo developers, and so Steam, ever the signal booster for indie games, had an idea. If your game was at least functional, you could release your work early, available for purchase at regular prices. This was done as a way to let developers get money during the development process, encouraging users to help fund games in a more reliable way than something like Kickstarter, already being given a product that you can play with the promise of more to come. This has saved careers, companies, and video games, and in my opinion has proven to be a godsend for many passionate people. Most of the time. Alright, so Steam Early Access launched in the March of 2013. A game called Project Zomboid became available through that service in November of the same year. It hasn't released yet. Now, Project Zomboid is a very well-made video game. It's an isometric zombie apocalypse survival game known for its brutal difficulty. Despite not yet having been released, it was among some of the earlier entries into the unforgivingly hard indie video game subgenre and still receives regular updates to this day. Zomboid is a dream project of the game's developers, the Indie Stone, but paradoxically, the game's success with the early access system is the thing that has delayed the game's release for so long. The questionnaire that comes with the marker gives us the devs' reason for remaining in early access. Project Zomboid is a much more ambitious game than we could have ever hoped to fund ourselves. It has grown massively over the years and it's been a roller coaster, but we now find ourselves in a stable financial situation with an overall positive reaction from the Steam community. Answering the eternal question of when further down, it reads, it should also be taken into consideration that the game is already very far through development. We'd estimate that we're 75% complete at this point, and we now have many 1,000+ hour players. There is a lot of content to enjoy in the game already, and we firmly and proudly believe it's worth the current price as it stands. Their answer for when 1.0 will release is when they can fulfill every single promise they've made on their website, a deeply unrealistic list for a small indie development studio, one that might take, say, 15 years to develop. But this is my issue here. Under a slightly different philosophy for what makes a game finished, this game has been finished for over half a decade. There is no actual functional difference between Terraria and Project Zomboid. Both of them are single-cost, regularly updated games by development studios exclusively dedicated to that game with mod support and niche established player bases and communities making content exclusively for the game. The product alone is no longer the only part of video games that can be monetized. Now it's the process itself. The promise that there is more to come, that with enough funding and time, the game can eventually become finally actually finished, or even more finished than before. The simple ability to change a game after it has been released has made the meaning of the word finished become utterly fucking meaningless. AAA studios in recent years have picked up on this, the line between what is good enough to officially release tipping further and further back into the traditionally beta territory. When Cyberpunk 2077 was released, they didn't think it was a finished game. How the fuck could they? But what they did understand is that the important part of game funding now isn't a game being complete on release, it's simply being accessible. The funding from the initial boost of sales is what allowed it to fix itself, and if it didn't get enough, they could just ditch it and move on to the next game. It's actually less risky for them to release it when they did because they simply had to invest less time in the game before seeing how it sold. But fuck it, Cyberpunk 2077 was finished when it was released. Mass Effect Andromeda was finished when it was released. No Man's Sky was finished when it was released. Because the only thing actually deciding this anymore is when the developer arbitrarily says so. There is no such thing as a finished video game anymore, just when it's accessible and if it's good or bad. Every game is a live service game now, whether anyone likes it or not. Cyberpunk was finished, Project Zomboid is not. Hallelujah. If you liked this video and watched through a lot of my other content and enjoyed that too, I would heavily suggest subscribing to the channel so you get more in the future. If you want to support me even more in my future endeavors, I have a Patreon you could subscribe to as well. For just $2 per video, you get to message me directly on Patreon, you get a role with custom colors on my Discord server, have your name in the credits of every video I make, and for the higher tiers I get to shout you out as well. Speaking of, shout out to my higher tier patrons: Jared Chode, Wallace de Morinville, Zimborg, Art Natlin, Brody Larson, Dinkley Voidley, Edmund Dong, Grinkle Stinkle, MF Bitchboy, Owen, Seven Syringe, A Magic Muffin, Bestest Patron, Brian Jackson, Connor, Fake Milk, Florian, Gluggle Jug, Maiden Batter, No Joke, Ribbonaster, Ro Ramden, Robin Michael Becker, I always mess up there, Soul of Phi Hearts, Ted H, Thomas Scott, and Undersea Rex CVT. Thank you again to all of my Patreon supporters, you should all be on screen, and with all that said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and have a nice day.